In this video, we'll look over 5 fantastic games in the King's Indian attack, played by the great Bobby Fischer, uncovering his hidden strategies and the potent attacks possible in this opening. The first opponent is Master Lamsaran Myagmarsaran, and Fischer starts e4 best by test. Black replies e6, the French defense, and white supports his pawn with d3. Black's d5 challenging the white center is met by knight d2 defending, while looking to at some point reroute the knight towards the king's side. After black plays knight f6, Fischer pushes his pawn to g3, preparing to fianchetto the bishop and planting the seeds for his King's Indian attack. The King's Indian attack is a versatile and strategic opening characterized by the moves e4, d3, placing the knights on d2 and f3, putting the bishop on g2, and castling kingside. Black replies with c5, taking advantage of white's slow play to control the center with pawns. Fischer fianchettos his bishop and black develops the knight to c6. White's knight going to f3 is followed by the black bishop moving to e7 before both sides castle their kings to safety. White pushes e5, gaining valuable space on the king side, and after black retreats the knight, adding an extra attacker to the pawn, white defends it with rook e1. Black's b5 attempts to create counterplay on the opposite end of the board, and white maneuvers the knight to f1, looking for a more active square, before black expands even further with b4. Fischer, with little fear for black's plans, notices that he may at some point want to place a piece on g5, and plays h4 supporting that square. a5 actuates an avalanche of pawns on the queen side, and white develops his bishop to f4. After black's a4, white finally responds to the pawn storm. He doesn't want black to push a3, as that would either give him an open a-file, or if white were to push the pawn, then there would be serious weaknesses in white's territory. So white pushes a3 himself, and black takes the pawn, planning to move the queen to b3 to target the b pawn, in case white were to recapture with the rook. Yet Fischer recaptures with the pawn, creating as few weaknesses as possible on the queen side, since his focus will shortly shift towards the black king side. Black leaps his knight to a5 with a long-term plan of pushing c4. White reactivates his knight on e3, and black adds pressure to c4 with bishop a6. Then white moves the bishop to h3 with a hidden idea that we'll see eventually. Black's d4 gains substantial central space while kicking the knight, who retreats to f1, looking to make use of the squares that the black pawn left behind. Black follows with knight b6, also planning a maneuver towards weak squares in white's territory. Fischer's knight finally jumps to g5, and queen h5 would be a menacing follow-up. Black replies with knight d5 hitting the bishop, who drops back to d2, preparing to capture the knight, were it to jump to c3. So black first grabs the knight on g5, enticing white to recapture with the bishop, hitting the queen but leaving the c3 square vulnerable. Black lifts the queen to d7, and white's queen springs to h5, drawing near the enemy king. Black swings his rook over to c8, bolstering his c4 pawn break, and white counters with knight d2. Then black's knight leaps to what appears to be a powerful post on c3. Yet black's pieces have all left their king stranded on the other side of the board. Fischer's marvelous move to gain the upper hand is bishop f6. This poisoned piece should not be taken, because if it were, it would give white a potent pawn on f6. White's threat would then be queen g5, forcing the king to f8, after which queen g7, followed by king e8 and queen g8 would be checkmate. So the only option would be king h8, getting out of any checks. Then the idea behind the earlier bishop h3 move comes to light. White would swoop the bishop to f5, threatening another checkmate, but also sacrificing the bishop. Black would have no choice but to take it, opening the e-file, and the rook would exploit it immediately, jumping to e7, hitting the queen. After the queen would drop to d8, white could take the pawn with the rook, threatening checkmate on h7, and once the queen would slide to g8 defending, rook g8 would force black to give up the queen for the rook, all while an attack on the king would still be in progress. Back to the game. Fischer's other threat in this position is Queen g5 threatening checkmate on g7. Black would have to play g6, after which Queen h6 would lead to an unstoppable checkmate on g7. So Black plays the only move to stay alive. Queen e8 preparing to meet Queen g5 with Queen f8 defending. White jumps the knight to e4, bringing more pieces into the attack and threatening a fork on d6. Black, in wanting to avoid any potential bishop sacrifices on g7, now that the knight could hop to f6 as well, plays g6, which also attacks the queen. After the queen slides over, Black captures the knight and White recaptures with the rook, preparing to swing it over to assist the attack. Then Black strikes with the explosive c4. Fischer ignores Black's plans, pushing on the other end with h5, and the Black king's shelter is about to be blown apart. Black takes the pawn on d3, and again White ignores Black's plans, sliding the rook over to h4. Black starts to notice that his king is in imminent danger, and lifts his rook to a7 so that it can defend laterally. White slyly drops his bishop back to g2, preparing his final combination. Now it's crucial that Black shifts his queen over to f8 to defend the diagonal. After that, the bishop would move to e4, and White's attack would still rage on despite not being as strong. Instead, Black takes the pawn on c2, and White takes advantage of Black's misstep by moving the queen to h6, threatening checkmate on g7. Now, even if Black were to promote here, White would take it, and then once Black would recapture, he would move his king to h2, not even recapturing the rook with his queen, since his attack will be more than decisive, and we'll see exactly why shortly. In the game, Black defends with Queen f8, and White has a beautiful combination to win. Can you find White's checkmate in 3? White's pieces are swarming the Black king, and the move Fischer plays to seal the deal is the remarkable queen sacrifice, queen takes h7. Black, seeing the bitter end, has no choice but to resign the game. Black would be forced to take the queen. Then White would capture the pawn on g6, giving double check. The king could either retreat to g8, after which rook h8 would be checkmate. Otherwise, he could take the pawn, and we would see the point of White's earlier bishop retreat, as it would go to e4 with checkmate. The next opponent is Grandmaster Oscar Pano, and he meets Fischer's e4 with c5, the Sicilian defense. The game proceeds with moves typical of the King's Indian attack, and Black takes a more defensive approach, also fianchettoing his bishop on the king's side. After White castles, Black develops the knight from g to e7, keeping his bishop's eyes open. White centralizes his rook on e1, and Black plays d6, opening his bishop, while preventing White from gaining too much central space with e5. Fischer carries on with c3, preparing a central pawn advance, and after Black castles, White's thrust forward with d4. Black takes it, and White recaptures, getting a powerful central pawn duo. Black immediately challenges it with e5, and White pushes his pawn, closing the center, while gaining space on the king's side, but getting a backwards pawn on d4, which means it cannot be defended by other pawns. Black develops the bishop to d7, and White brings out the knight to c3. Black's rook c8 puts the rook on the open file, and White activates his bishop on f4. Then Black jumps the knight to a5, not only looking at the c4 square, but opening the lane for the bishop to land on a more active square. Fischer slides his rook over to c1, contesting the open file, and Black launches his b-pawn, looking to bother White's pieces. White pushes b3, stopping the knight from landing on c4, and Black plays b4, kicking the knight back to e2. Finally, Black puts his bishop on b5, where its scope is increased. White lifts his queen to d2, creating a battery aimed at the king's side, and Black returns his knight to c6, with its duty on the rim fulfilled. White follows with g4, not only expanding on the king side, but making way for the knight to land on g3. And black fights back on the queen side, looking to create white pawn weaknesses with a5. White maneuvers the knight to g3, and black swoops his queen to b6, targeting the weak d4 pawn a second time. Fischer doesn't see any danger in black's moves, launching his h-pawn, which lays the groundwork for an assault on the black king. Black, realizing that he should switch gears and start defending, drops the knight to b8, planning to reroute it towards his king side, while opening the rooks to one another. White swoops his bishop to h6, aiming to eliminate black's pivotal defensive bishop, and black, with no good way of stopping this trade, carries on maneuvering his knight to d7. White's queen gets in on the action, jumping to g5, and black finally trades rooks, giving white full control of the c-file after he recaptures. Then he trades bishops, hoping that with less pieces on the board, white's attack wouldn't be as strong. Fischer recaptures with the queen, as it takes commanding control over the black king's home. Black slides his other rook over to c8, and white chops it off, resulting in the black knight retreating to passivity on c8. Then white pushes h5, and the black kingside's future is looking grim. Black retreats the queen to d8, and white's knight jumps to g5, threatening a checkmate in 2, with queen takes h7, followed by king f8, and queen takes f7. Black defends desperately with knight f8, before white unveils a stunning sacrifice, bishop e4. The point is, were the bishop to be taken, then white would recapture with the third rank knight, and then it would be impossible to stop that knight from going to f6, where the threat of capturing twice on h7, first with the knight, then with the queen, who would give checkmate in 2, would be pretty much unstoppable. Unless black were to give up the queen for the knight. So black leaves the bishop alone, lifting the queen to e7 so it can defend the 7th rank laterally once the f-pawn moves, which it most likely will. Fischer's sacrificial spree persists as the knight gobbles the pawn on h7. Black cannot let that knight get to f6 as it would be devastating, so he accepts the sacrifice. Then white grabs the pawn on h6 with his pawn, threatening the knight, forcing black to recapture the pawn. White takes it again with his bishop, removing the last pawn from the king's castle, leaving the king in desolate disarray. White has the idea now of taking the knight, and after the queen would recapture, he would take on e6, forking the king and the other knight. So black jumps his knight out of the way to g5. White moves his knight to h5, looking at f6, and there's really nothing black can do about it at this point. He hops his knight to f3, giving a rather meaningless check. The king moves to g2 counterattacking, and the knight gives another check on h4. The king advances again, tickling the knight, who grabs the bishop on g6. Fischer doesn't even recapture, as it would give the black king a chance to run away. Instead, he finally comes through with knight f6 check, and the king's only choice is f7. Then white has a wonderful way to win the game. Can you find the checkmate in 2? All that's left in the white army is 2 pieces, yet the queen and knight make a formidable duo. The move Fischer plays to end the game is queen h7 check, inducing a black resignation. The only move would be king f8, after which queen g8 would be checkmate. The third opponent is Grandmaster Borislav Ivkov, and he meets the King's Indian attack by fighting back in the center with d5. Fischer maintains the tension, developing his knight to d2, and black brings his bishop out to d6. White plays bishop g2, and black moves the knight from g to d7 before both sides castle their kings to safety. Then white moves his knight to h4, making way for the f-pawn to advance. And with black's pawns in the way of the light-squared bishop, black plays b6, creating a new avenue for its development. White's f4 is met by a capture on e4, and white, in wanting to preserve his strong central control, recaptures with the pawn. but this opens the diagonal for the black bishop to develop with tempo as it hits the rook. Fischer sidesteps his rook to e1, and black pushes c4, gaining some space, while also opening the square for his bishop. White, in not wanting to allow black to push the pawn again, which despite sacrificing a pawn would severely damage the white pawn structure, pushes his pawn to c3. Black hops his knight to a5, guarding the pawn so that his bishop can drop back to the long diagonal on b7. And after black pushes e5, gaining substantial space on the king side while attacking the bishop and opening an attack on the rook, black moves the bishop to c5 with check. White's king moves to the corner, and the other black knight jumps to a powerful post on d5, which also blocks the bishop's attack. Yet, black's pieces are a little all over the place, and it will take a few turns for them to reorganize. Fischer doesn't waste any time, moving his knight to d4 as he prepares his army for a potent push on the king side. Black drops his bishop to b7, where it contests the long diagonal, and white swoops his queen onto h5, drawing near the enemy king. After black retreats the knight to e7, looking to defend the king, while opening his bishop, white pushes g4, launching a pawn storm, and black, probably afraid of the potential for the knight to jump in with tricky ideas, decides to remove it from the board altogether by capturing it with his bishop. Yet, this was a bad idea. Black's bishop was a powerful piece, and it was responsible for fighting against white's strong light-squared bishop. Fischer recaptures the bishop with his now unopposed bishop, threatening checkmate on h7. Black should not block with the knight because it would allow white to first dodge the knight exchange before sending his f-pawn forward with tempo. So black plays g6, blunting the diagonal but creating dark-squared weaknesses, which the white queen immediately exploits, moving to h6. Now black desperately wants to get his bishop to f8 to defend the dark squares near his king. He starts by moving his knight out of the way to d5. But this plan is a little too slow, as white thrusts forward with f5. Black slides the rook over to e8, finally opening the square for his bishop, before white captures the pawn on g6, threatening a checkmate in 2 by capturing on h7, then f7. So black recaptures with the f-pawn. Fischer responds with a spectacular sacrifice. Knight takes g6. This knight cannot be taken, as white would recapture with the queen, giving check. The king wouldn't be able to go to the corner because of queen h7 checkmate. So it would have to go to f8, but then white would swoop the bishop to h6, forcing the king to e7, after which queen g7 would be checkmate. Black instead lifts his queen to d7 so that once the knight moves, which it does, going to f4, the queen can defend the h7 pawn from white's two attackers. Black follows by bringing his other rook over to the open d-file. Fischer moves his knight to h5, looking to jump into f6 with check. The king shifts over to h8, getting out of the check and making way for the rook, but the knight jumps to f6 anyway. Black captures it, the pawn recaptures, and you could say that that white pawn who dominates the black king side is as valuable as a full piece. Black slides his rook over to g8, defending the pivotal g-file while attacking white's pawn. White lifts his dark-squared bishop to f4, preparing his final combination as he leaves his g-pawn undefended, and black grabs it. Then white activates his last piece as the rook slides over to d1, attacking the queen. Now black cannot take the rook because the queen is responsible for defending against checkmate on h7. Instead, black sneakily swings his rook over to g8, threatening to turn the tables on white. Were white to capture the queen, then black would be able to play rook g1 check, and after the white rook would recapture, black would recapture with the other rook, who, supported by the bishop, would give checkmate. But Fischer is not one to fall for such tricks. White has a brutal winning combination here. Can you find the checkmate in 6? With all of white's pieces swarming the kingside and black's defenses on the verge of collapsing, the move Fischer plays to trigger black's downfall is f7. Black, realizing his inevitable fate, resigns the game. This pawn move not only cuts off the black queen's defense of h7, but it also opens the diagonal aimed at the black king. Were black to take the pawn, then bishop e5 would force any one of black's pieces to block, after which white could take the pawn on h7 with checkmate, exploiting the pin on the major piece to the king. So black would have two ways here to prolong checkmate as long as possible, but they both lead to the same continuation. He could either play rook 4 to g6, blocking white's light-squared bishop, or rook 8 to g7, defending the checkmate. Either way, white's next move would be bishop e5. If black moved the other rook, then he would have to block the check with the 8th rank rook. But in this case, black would move the rook from 4 to g6, blocking the checkmate on h7. White would take it with the bishop, and it wouldn't be able to be recaptured because of the pin. Black would follow with queen b7 check, white would block with the rook, black would take it, white would recapture, and black's next move wouldn't matter, the finish would be queen h7 checkmate. The fourth opponent is international master James Sherwin, and he takes the slower approach in response to the King's Indian attack, developing his pieces and getting castled. After Fischer's knight b to d2, black plays rook b8, playing it extra safe by immediately getting out of the white bishop's view, and white in turn shifts the rook over to reinforce an e5 pawn break at some point. Black pushes d6, fighting back for that square, and white's c3 prepares a different advance in the center. b6 solidifies the c5 point while opening a new lane for the bishop, and white strikes with d4. Black replies by maintaining the tension and moves the queen to c7. Fischer expands further with e5, attacking the knight, and while black could take the pawn, he decides to jump his knight to d5 instead. White captures on d6, getting a semi-open file for his rook, and luring the bishop to d6, where it becomes a target for white's knight as it jumps to e4. Black chooses to leave his bishop alone, pushing c4, stopping white from playing c4 to kick black's powerful knight. White chops the bishop, and after black recaptures, the white knight leaps to g5, tickling the black kingside. Black maneuvers his knight to e7, so that after white lifts his queen to c2, threatening checkmate on h7, he can block with knight g6. Now, the reason Fischer chose to move his queen to c2 instead of h5 was because he wanted to leave the path open for his pawn as it starts its march on h4. Black takes a defensive stance, dropping his other knight to f6 to prevent white's h5, and white replies with the stunning sacrifice, knight takes h7. Now black doesn't need to take the knight, but white just won a free pawn and will take the black knight next, shattering the kingside pawn structure. Recapturing with the king would create a pin on the knight, allowing bishop f4, which would get a full rook in return for the knight. So black takes with the knight, leaving h5 unprotected, giving white the freedom to push the pawn, kicking the other knight. While it could drop safely to e7, white would reply with bishop f4, skewering the queen and getting the full rook. For that reason, black jumps the knight to h4, giving back the piece. Fischer doesn't take it just yet, first playing bishop f4 to develop with tempo. The queen drops to d8, and white shouldn't take the rook because black would take the bishop on g2, and after white would recapture, black would be able to play bishop b7 check with a discovered attack to win back the bishop, getting two pieces for the rook. Instead, white takes back the knight, emerging up a pawn after everything. And despite his poor kingside pawn structure, he should be able to use his h-pawns to his advantage in an impending attack on black's king. Black's rook is still under fire, and with nowhere safe to go, it jumps to b7. White could take it, but black would be happy to give away the rook for white's valuable bishop. His light-squared bishop would then take full control of the weak diagonal, and the black queen would soon jump in to attack the extremely vulnerable king. Fischer leaves the rook and instead hits first with h6. Black doesn't want to take the pawn, opening his kingside, and if he pushes the pawn, then white will strike again with h5. So he captures the hanging h4 pawn with his queen, allowing white to take on g7. Black should just save his rook, using the pawn as an umbrella for his king. But he captures it, walking his king into the open. White lifts his rook to e4, indirectly attacking the queen, who moves to h5. Then he drops his rook to e3, preparing to slide it over to the alluring g and h files. Black's f5 is an attempt to weaken the white queen's influence over the kingside, but it really just weakens the kingside further. Fischer slides his rook over to h3, hitting the queen, and she can't go to the g file because of the rook g3 pin. So she goes all the way back to e8. Bishop e5 takes advantage of the overextended black pawns, since the check cannot be blocked with a pawn. The knight jumps to f6, saving the king, but not for long, with the white queen shifting to d2, where she is a move away from infiltration. Black begins the runaway, and the queen swoops into g5, forcing the king to stay put. Were he to flee to e7, then the knight would become pinned by the white queen. Rook h7 would follow, and were black to dodge to d8, then white would pick up the knight. Otherwise, were the rook to block, then it too would become pinned by the white rook, and white could even take the knight with his queen. So black has no choice but to defend the knight with his queen. White captures it, and black recaptures. Now white has one and only one move to win the game. Can you find the best move? To find this move, one must notice that the king and rook are along the same file, and the move Fischer plays to exploit this is rook h7. Black's only good choice is to drop the king back to e8 before white grabs the queen. Were black to recapture, then white would take twice on b7, emerging up a full rook. Instead, black tries taking the rook on h7. White's bishop swoops to c6 with check, and black, deciding he's had enough, resigns the game. Either way, black blocks the check. White's going to take the pawn on e6 next, and let's not forget that white is up a queen for a rook, which is already a decisive amount of material. The final opponent is Roberto Rodriguez, and as we play through the moves characteristic of the King's Indian attack, we see that black chooses to fianchetto his bishop on the king side as well. White plays c3, blunting the bishop's diagonal while preparing a potential advance in the center, but is beat to the punch as black lunges with d5. White can no longer play d4 without hanging his e4 pawn. So he lifts his queen to e2, supporting his pawn, and after black castles, he is now able to push it forward to e5, gaining substantial kingside space. Black replies with f5, trying to close things down, but white takes the pawn en passant. Black recaptures and can at least say that white no longer has the central space. Fischer's bishop then swoops in, snatching the diagonal that the black bishop just left behind to attack the rook. Black shifts it over to e8, and white pushes g4, gaining ground on the king side. Black counters with e5, opening his bishop's attack on the pawn, so white defends it with h3. Then black develops his queen to c7, and white pushes c4, trying to weaken the long diagonal for his fianchettoed bishop. In response, black pushes e4, attacking the knight. White takes the pawn, and after black recaptures, white jumps his knight to g4, putting multiple attackers on the pawn. Black lets it go, and in compensation lands his knight on a powerful post on d4. Fischer wins the pawn with his queen, pinning the knight to the rook, and black unpins, developing the bishop to d7. There aren't really any good discovered attacks by the rook, so white carries on development with knight c3. Black's bishop c6 attacking the queen is followed by queen d3 dodging before black trades light squared bishops and the king recaptures on g2. Then the other black rook swings over to d8, indirectly hitting the queen, and white counters with knight e4. Again, there isn't really a good discovered attack for the rook. Meanwhile, the bishop is under fire and its capture would come with check. So black lifts the queen a square to c6 defending and pinning the knight to the king. Fischer activates his first rook, contesting the open e-file, and black slides his king further from the action while opening the square for his knight to drop to defend his bishop and kick the enemy bishop. White brings the other rook to d1 and black moves his knight to f5, finally opening a discovered attack on the queen. Yet that knight was well placed on d4 and moving it didn't do much to help black's cause. White is able to block the attack while simultaneously improving his knight as it's centralized on d5. Black's knight continues its drift away from the action as it jumps to h4 with check, and white calmly ducks his king to f1. Then black drops his other knight to g8, defending his bishop his second time while attacking the white bishop. Fischer chomps the bishop with his knight, opening the rooks to one another. Black first exchanges the rooks, and after white recaptures taking control of the e-file, black recaptures the knight with his own. In this position, white has one move to gain a decisive advantage. Can you find white's best move? The black king is stranded in the corner, naked and afraid, and the move Fischer plays is the simple but potent queen c3. Black, seeing no way out, throws in the towel and resigns the game. The knight is pinned, under attack twice, and only defended once. Even if black were to defend it, g5 is coming, and that guarantees a full piece advantage, all while the black king is still in a suspicious spot. I hope these games were both entertaining and instructive. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more chess content.